This essay is going to be very negative towards True Detective Night Country, so let's get a few things out of the way. To make a show in itself is a miracle. So many people have to come together and fit all the pieces together. Even getting greenlit by HBO is an achievement in itself. I would like to believe that bad scripts don't get produced. There had to be something in Night Country that HBO saw potential in, which is why it is also so bizarre that this is the end product. There are numerous ways I could structure this post-mortem, so let's first narrow what this essay isn't going to be. I have no interest in calling out Isa Lopez specifically, nor do I care about the drama between Lopez and Pizzolatto. Furthermore, Isa Lopez has already been hired for the next season as a showrunner, so technically me critiquing Night Country is punching up, not down. I'm going to be referring to her interviews a few times to make sense of some of the choices relating to the narrative, but apart from that, I don't want to center this critique around her specifically. I don't care about the toxic discourse that is buzzing around this show. I suspect that anything I say about the season will be interpreted as misogyny by one viewer and as woke by another. There's plenty of bad in the narrative to critique even without trying to tie the season into American politics. I can desire representation in my television shows and also want those shows to be written well. Both things can be true at the same time. There are some clear storytelling issues in Night Country. To drill down on these problems, I've separated the essay into 4 different sections, those being the characters, the story, the tie-ins, and the supernatural. There's going to be some recapping of the events, but I would still recommend watching Night Country before this video. I am also going to be comparing Night Country to the first season of True Detective, as the success of that narrative is the reason why Night Country exists in the first place. The 4th season also refers back to the first season many times. HBO even had the brilliant idea of pushing these connections through their marketing, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, let's get into it. Put on Twist and Shout, crack a Lone Star, get comfortable. Spoilers for the first season of True Detective and True Detective Night Country. What do you want from me? The show follows investigators Liz Danvers and Evangeline Navarro as they begin to investigate the disappearance of 8 researchers in a remote town in Alaska. Honestly, the missing scientists are just the starting point for the narrative, and we'll circle back to it when we get to talk about the story more broadly. Centering the show around 2 female investigators is a very welcome addition to a show that has been very male-centric in the previous seasons. The first season especially caught a lot of criticism because it was centered around the male perspective. I don't agree with these criticisms personally, as in my opinion the whole point is to focus on the male-centric toxicity of these 2 guys, but I wouldn't want to imply that a season centering around a female perspective would be unwelcome. In fact, I was very excited by the idea that there would be a narrative of this nature from a largely female perspective. Just like with Rust and Marty, give these protagonists questionable motives and ethics. Show us in turn how women manipulate men. Night Country strives to make Danvers and Navarro match the morally questionable detectives of the previous seasons. Danvers especially isn't intended to be likable, which is a bold choice.
And she said, well, I love the idea of a woman that is on the verge of a breakdown. And what if she says things that just come out of her mouth and are the absolute wrong thing? And what if some of the ideas in her head are honestly even racist and she doesn't think or realize they're racist? So we started to play with this character. And at the end of that meeting, I said, okay, so if I'm getting this right, what you want from Danvers is for her to be an asshole.
At the end of the day, it is far more interesting to follow detectives who are willing to break the rules to get ahead in the investigation than to center the show around morally conscious characters. So, just like Rust and Marty, Danvers and Navarro break the laws and disobey their superiors to find out the truth. That's about as much as I can muster a good defense for these characters, which is really unfortunate because I honestly would like to see more complex female characters take the center stage in the shows that are as highly marketed as Night Country is. What made Rust and Marty interesting in the first season was their contrasting personalities. Marty is a walking, breathing contradiction, at the same time presenting himself as a family man and having extramarital affairs.
You know how it is, you want a wife but only half the time.
Marty is a character that strives to control the women in his life, going as far as to break the law when his grip on them starts to slip. Rust, on the other hand, is a man who has lost virtually everyone in his life. This is why Rust is so spiteful towards Marty at the beginning of the first season. Marty has exactly what Rust has lost, and yet he still neglects it. There's also a clear distinction between the two in-world views. This juxtaposition in character is the reason it is so interesting to sit in a car with these two. On the surface, it does feel like Night Country tries to imitate this dynamic. Navarro is obsessed with the murder of Annie K, a case that she tried to solve before the events of the show, but ultimately failed. So kinda like Rust with the Dora Lang case. Danvers feels a bit more analytical, whereas Navarro is brash and often takes action when faced with injustice. It should be noted, however, that these differences in character are very minimal. Danvers isn't exactly the Sherlock of her own universe, nor is Navarro the stereotypical hothead detective, almost to the point that it feels like the screenwriters were trying to avoid these tropes deliberately. Where they didn't avoid the body cop genre tropes is in the dialogue. Most of the dialogue between the two comes off as snarky just because the writer thought, these are cynical detectives, they should be snarky and insult each other constantly. It's the detectives ribbing each other trope, which to be fair also exists in many other narratives in this genre as well. Rust and Marty in the first season are exactly like this, but the reason that dynamic works is because the contrasting personalities are so clear. With Danvers and Navarro, not so much. The background that informs this dynamic, the most interesting part of their partnership, how they became partners and went on to game and a suspect, has already happened before the show even starts. So for the first half of the show, the audience is completely lost on why Danvers supposedly doesn't want to work with Navarro, or why they're constantly insulting each other. I know it's kinda cliche to want the dynamic to be contrasting personalities, as is the case often with the body cop trope, but as it stands, there isn't all that much to glean onto with the dynamic between Danvers and Navarro. It's honestly a bold move from a writing point of view to give so little context for the reason that these characters act the way that they do. The only problem is that we're already juggling numerous different backstories, which are also hinted at instead of stated plainly, but we'll get to this. The will they won't they of their partnership in the first 2 episodes feels completely pointless. I've seen the posters, I know where this is headed, so why is the show so clingy about not providing the body cop experience to the audience? I get that the partnership is strained due to the Wheeler case, but separating these characters for the first 33% of the narrative really wasn't necessary. If the implication is that Danvers actually doesn't want to work with Navarro, then she does an awful lot of work to get her back on the case. In the end, Danvers even admits that she was going to game and Wheeler also, so what was the point?
You're not gonna stop me? No.
5 minutes later.
Seriously, that frozen motherfucker out there is the only witness we had!
To drill down on this dynamic between the two, let's examine Danvers and Navarro individually.
What do you want from me?
As I already alluded to, Danvers isn't presented as a morally righteous character. In fact, she is an awful boss and repeatedly abuses Pete Pryor's goodwill to further her investigative instincts. Even to the point that it kinda ends up feeling like Pete's the one who actually drives forward the investigation, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Danvers is an inattentive mother and generally doesn't support her stepdaughter's interests.
Did you see me play? No. Did you see the manager?
A part of this is bizarrely tied to Danvers not wanting Leah to discover her roots. A joke that Night Country makes a couple of times is that Danvers has also slept with many of the married men in Ennis.
Oh, you didn't. Is there anyone this time you fucked?
Giving the impression that she's the type of character that will bend the rules if it serves her personal interests. So this drives the audience to think like, why is Danvers so bossy and callous? The first episodes imply that she has lost a child, although this isn't made explicit. That's an important distinction, by the way, and will become a constant issue with the storytelling, but for the sake of brevity, let's specify her background with the benefit of hindsight. Danvers lost her husband and her son in a car accident. The details of this accident incidents are incredibly vague, but what we know from the other characters' dialogue, this made her more cynical about the world. The reason that she is in Ennis to begin with is because Connolly wanted to get rid of her from his precinct. According to Connolly, she was transferred because she was bad with people and got dramatically worse after the death of her husband and child. That is not to say that Danvers doesn't have any redeeming qualities. There are a few moments in episode 3 and 4 where her softer side comes out. First, when she cuddles a child with a cute story about the unicorn on the child's shirt, and secondly, when she saves Navarro's sister Julia, who is going through a psychotic episode. These scenes further support the idea that Danvers wasn't always like this, and that she's only become cynical after her husband and child passed away. The problem with this style of storytelling is that it becomes very difficult to form a thorough picture of Danvers as a character. There's this vague tragedy in her past, we know that she has maybe lost a child, but this knowledge doesn't exactly translate to how the audience is supposed to understand why Danvers doesn't support her daughter learning about her roots, for example. The audience can piece her character together by looking at her actions in the present and contrasting them to the vague trauma in her past, but at that point, the storytelling has become so subtle that it's more irritating than interesting. I can piece together that Danvers doesn't support Leah exploring her roots to the Yonapiat culture because it reminds Danvers of Jake, but I can only do so having seen the whole season. Just like with the partnership between Danvers and Navarro and the Wheeler case, this personal history is for some reason obscured from the viewers. In contrast to Rust in the first season, the audience learns that he has lost his daughter 43 minutes into the first episode.
Children?
One. She passed.
This scene immediately answers the question of why is this guy like this? This is a key part of Rust as a character. We need to know where he comes from so that we can understand him in the present. Danvers' arc is about her facing the trauma of losing her husband and son. This trauma is conveyed in the form of flashbacks and in scenes where Danvers can't stand Twist and Shout by the Beatles, a song that she used to listen to with her son. The narrative forces this information onto the audience by having a DVD on Salal's station be looped to a scene of Ferris Bueller's Day Off on 2 different occasions. Why is that? I don't know. I guess Clark just likes this scene in particular. This makes no sense to me. And surprise, surprise, Danvers sees her son under the ice, tries to save him, and falls under. She is saved by Navarro, and the two have a chat about what just happened. Navarro reveals that in an earlier hallucination of her son, he mentioned that he sees you, referring to Danvers. This revelation, and I suppose hearing her son in the snowstorm, changes Danvers' outlook on the world. This isn't necessarily a bad conclusion to the arc. It shows that a part of Danvers' cynicism was tied to the fact that she didn't believe in the afterlife, making the loss of her son even more tragic.
We're here, Navarro. Okay, alone. The dead are gone.
Confronted here with the knowledge that her son is watching over her, she can start the healing process. The problem lies in how the conclusion to this arc is delivered. In writing, there's a common adage of show don't tell. What this usually means is that when we're writing our characters, it is often better to show their personalities through character actions rather than having some other character describe who they are. Night Country clearly abides by this logic. So much of Danvers' background isn't given to the audience through the dialogue, but by how she reacts to the world and characters around her. Similarly, when we start to get more glimpses into her background, we do so by seeing the moment that caused her trauma. Where this technique begins to fail is in how little we actually receive from Danvers. The character flaw which informs the audience why Danvers takes any given action in the story is obscured so profoundly that it becomes difficult to relate to her. Another thing that makes the unpacking of these characters so difficult is that the bits of information aren't given to us in any logical order. We just learn a lot of interesting things about Danvers' background, but it only starts to make sense in the final episode when it's already too late to develop a connection to the character. Keep in mind, by the way, that's not the only plotline in this show. There are so many different obscure plotlines. Ultimately, why even hide her loss? Is it to keep the audience interested in her backstory, which is made apparent in the final episode? If that is the case, then it isn't a particularly interesting hook in a show that is about a murder and possible supernatural phenomena. Is it to avoid leaning on the loss too much, as it might come off as a tired trope of the detective genre? If that's the case, then the screenwriters should have formed a less cliché backstory for this character.
What do you want from me?
Let's move on to Navarro. At the beginning of the season, the audience is shown that she holds everyone around her at an arm's length. She has an intimate relationship with Kavik, a bartender in Ennis, who clearly wants more from her than the intimate correspondence, but she doesn't reciprocate. She's bullish and has a habit of punishing men who hurt women with her own form of justice. This is displayed in her pouring Baileys into the gas tank of a guy who abused his girlfriend, and with Navarro game-ending Wheeler and, later on, Clark. The reason for this is further elaborated with Navarro revealing that she had a father that used to get drunk and beat her mother and her. After she hears about her sister's demise, she goes to get beat up by a group of men, perhaps implying a sense of self-harm, but that once again might be reading a bit too much into it. This could as well be her sense of personal justice, although this time it doesn't work. Overall, I just get the sense that Navarro is a character that has trouble expressing her feelings outside of the moments where she is in literal pain. A large part of her arc deals with her not being able to fit into either side of the culture of Ennis, those being the indigenous people and the non-indigenous people. Her mother was a Christian and didn't tell Navarro her Inupiat name, something that has clearly caused her to feel like she doesn't belong to the Inupiat community or culture. She, however, has access to connections that Pete Pryor doesn't have, for example, which is a neat detail to her character.
It's called Muckluck Telegraph. Not for white boys.
There's also some mental health issues with the Navarros. What we know is that Navarro's mother heard voices and had episodes. Eventually she disappeared and was found dead, someone having game-ended her. Navarro's sister Julia also suffers from this mental illness. Navarro herself has a few hallucinations in the first 3 episodes, but they get much worse after the death of her sister. Now, there's a lot to be said about the supernatural elements in the show, and I don't want to muddle up this character section with that. However, for this arc, it should be specified that the people in Ennis do experience supernatural occurrences, such as Rose seeing the ghost of Travis Cole. So when Navarro too experiences these things in the earlier episodes, it isn't treated as the family curse coming for her, it's more like the supernatural elements of Ennis appearing to her, which is totally fine for most of the characters. The designated log lady Rose comments on this in episode 2.
Don't confuse the spirit world with mental health issues.
It is frustrating that this family curse plotline becomes such an important part of her character arc so late into the narrative. Even though Navarro sees hallucinations in the first half of the season, there isn't any implication that she's in actual danger like her sister or mother were. I can buy that the death of her sister makes her mental state even worse than before, but there simply isn't enough time to introduce this threat to her mental well-being when there's only 2 episodes left in the show. Navarro's arc is about many things. It's about her coming to terms with the mental illness in her family. It's about her finding her place in the Ennis community. It's about finally resolving the Annie K case. Navarro's character arc is resolved in a more open-ended manner. She walks onto the ice and it isn't clear if she passed or just left Ennis. A lot of criticism towards the ending has been about Navarro's arc specifically, which to many implies that self-harm is a satisfying ending for this character. As it isn't clear what exactly happens, I'm not going to spend time discussing the moralities of ending a character's arc like this. What I will say is that whatever version you decide to believe here, it is going to be disappointing. If Navarro game ends herself, then it is a poor story choice because it comes out of freaking nowhere. She's had visions from episode 1, but they started to become a problem only an episode ago, and now she's already at a point where she's walking onto the ice. Like, I get that she's in a vulnerable place as a character after the death of her sister, but this arc races to its conclusion far too fast. She says in the final episode that she's been holding the hatch for so long, whereas it has really not felt like she has had any problems before the end of episode 4. There's this one scene that could indicate this ending if you squint hard enough.
Don't you ever get this feeling like sometimes you just wanna just disappear?
But it definitely isn't enough to signal the audience that this is where we are headed. If this really was the logical endpoint that the writers saw for this character, then there really should have been more build up to this conclusion in the first 2 to 3 episodes. There really should be more scenes where she is visibly distraught by the events that are happening to her. So how about her disappearing then? just packing up and leaving Ennis. This in turn feels like a weird endpoint to her character because a significant part of the narrative has been spent on establishing her roots as an Inupiat. She doesn't belong, and once she gets more in touch with her roots, she just decides to leave, I guess. Isn't this exactly why her Inupiat name is revealed to her? I mean, you could spin it among the lines of, she can now begin anew somewhere else, but this borders on writing fanfiction, and once again, it isn't very satisfying or a logical conclusion to this arc. In fact, so much of the character analysis I've done for this essay feels like I'm writing fanfiction. The character arcs are there, but you really have to do a lot of work to connect the dots. Ultimately, if you're writing a story that is this character-centric, I'll talk about how little the mystery matters in the next section, you need to be aware that most of the character development happens between the lines. It's honestly a style of writing that I would expect from an 800-page novel, not from a 6-episode season of television. The first season got away with this partially due to the voiceover that was incorporated into the show with the interrogations of Rust and Marty, but here there's far too little to clue the audience into what these characters are going through mentally, except the hallucinations and visions. And even those are very vague.
What do you want from me?
At least Danvers and Navarro get conclusions to their arcs, because the same cannot be said about the side characters Pete, Hank, Leah, or Kayla. Now this is where the wheels start to come off the proverbial narrative vehicle. Pete Pryor is established as this rookie detective who wants to become better by learning from Danvers. The payoff is that he constantly undermines his family in exchange, running errands for Danvers even in his off hours. Making things more complicated is the fact that Pete's father, Hank, is a corrupt cop whom he has to rise up against due to being Danvers' protege. This is an interesting skeleton for a character arc, and it pulls the audience into thinking if Pete will eventually choose his family over being a cop. This is even hinted towards with Kayla saying that she didn't marry Pete because he was a cop, she married him because he was a sweet idiot that made her laugh. What ends up happening is that Pete spends even more time investigating the Salal case, he gets kicked out of his house, and eventually game ends his own father. So okay, maybe we're searching for a breaking point for this character. One would expect Pete to come to the realization that he can't be a detective like Danvers because it requires breaking the law and neglecting his family. But no, Pete gets rid of Hank's body and still remains as a cop under Danvers. So okay, how does the family dynamic go then? Well, Pete tells Kayla that he needs her help just this one time and it will be fine afterwards. Kayla agrees and that's that. I'm really trying not to sound too harsh here, but what was the actual point here? Pete goes through a lot in this narrative, yet seemingly it doesn't change his character in the slightest. The reason that Pete's family life seemingly changes is because Danvers changes. This is a very poor choice because it undercuts everything that Pete experienced in the narrative. Pete doesn't earn his family back, the narrative gives it back to him because we have to be wrapping things up. Pete sitting on the ice after dumping his father's body into the water has the dramatic gravitas of a shrug. The show connects the time when Hank saved Pete from drowning by hacking up the ice to this present moment where Pete is hacking up the ice to hide his father's corpse, but what are we supposed to take from this? A sense of dramatic irony? A sense of twisted justice? I just don't get it. It really does feel like the show didn't know what the intended message was. In this scene, is Pete sad? Is he tired? Does he regret committing patricide? It's all just left dangling in a profoundly unsatisfying way. And that's nothing compared to how Kayla was handled. Kayla, this character that is shown throughout the season to be profoundly annoyed with how Pete spends all of his time running errands for Danvers, just takes Pete back for no apparent reason. One could argue that Pete was finally honest to her in that moment where he admitted that he needed to do just this one thing, and that somehow changed her mind, but for the love of God, how much do I, as the viewer, have to write fanfiction for these character arcs to make sense? It is a downright bizarre way to wrap up this arc. Remember when Pete implied that Kayla might regret her marriage and her child in episode 4?
That I ruined your life and you didn't want to have the baby.
Oh well, I guess we're not going to use that at all. You can't just hint towards an accusation this serious and leave it hanging. Am I supposed to believe that the relationship is better after the events of the final episode? Because in my headcanon, and as Pete still is working under Danvers implies, nothing has changed. Leah, Danvers Danvers' arc too just kinda ends. Throughout the season, she's getting more in touch with her roots, which pisses off her mother for reasons that I still don't understand. She has a girlfriend and they participate in a protest. The girlfriend betrays her and it falls completely flat because we know nothing about said girlfriend. She moves out of the Danvers household because she can't stand being around her mother. And in the end, after her mother has an epiphany, she's just cool with her again. We don't get a speech where Liz Danvers explains why she's been so mean to her. She doesn't talk about her trauma to Leah, and it's just left up in the air. I get that Leah accepts her now because Danvers for once chose the Ennis community over her police work, but once again, the show doesn't hint towards this at all. Are we to believe that Danvers told Leah about the murder scientists and the justice ladies? All of these arcs feel like a few scenes are missing, as if they were lost in the editing or something. If there's anything that I want to impart with this section, it is that in a show that has this many characters and this little time, more care should have been placed into doing something meaningful with the central cast of characters. I love subtext as much as the next guy, but at some point the screenwriter should realize that experiencing characters this way is rather annoying. Alternatively, if you know that you're going to be struggling to bring all these character arcs to a completion, don't give them arcs at all. Remember here that all of these arcs also eat screen time from the central mystery.
What do you want from me?
Night Country presents a clear departure in narrative structure to the other entries in the series. First and foremost, the 4th season is only 6 episodes, whereas the previous seasons have been 8. At first glance, this change seemed like a smart idea. If you have a compelling story that can be told in just 6 episodes, then by all means, thank you for not wasting my time. Unfortunately, Night Country feels incredibly hollow with its 6-episode run. I'm almost tempted to use the simple story complex characters term here, but I think the mystery is just complex enough that it is unwarranted. Regardless, I have no doubt in my mind that the screenwriters were more interested in the characters than in the mystery. The season spends so much time fleshing out the characters that it's difficult to even follow what is currently happening in the mystery. In case some of you were doubting this, let's take a gander at how the show itself handles the central mystery. Episode 1 establishes the missing scientists, shifts the focus to the investigation of the Annie K case, and at the end shows that most of the scientists have died. Episode 2 has Danvers move the corpsicle to the local ice rink. They discovered that one of the scientists, Clark, had a creepy RV and that he dated Annie K. Both had the spiral symbol tattooed, only Clark got it after Annie's death. It is also discovered that Clark isn't in the corpsicle. In episode 3, the police force starts looking for Clark. The relationship between Annie K and Clark is expanded upon. A veterinarian is hired to look at the corpsicle, and he comes to the conclusion that the scientists died before they froze. It is also implied that they died from fright. Very intriguing indeed. Danvers and Navarro go talk to Oliver Takak, who used to work at Salal Station. I'm sure I butchered that name, by the way. I'm really trying here. Oliver Takag dodges the questions and tells them to leave. The pair then goes to talk to Lund, the last surviving Salal scientist, who spouts a bunch of stuff about the scientists waking someone up. He goes full on exorcist and dies, although I think it is implied that this is Navarro's mental illness surfacing instead of something supernatural happening. Who knows? Finally, Pete cracks Annie's phone, within which is a video where she is grabbed and presumably game ended. In episode 4, the corpsicle is shipped off to Anchorage. Pete discovers that there's yet another dude that has similar injuries to the Salal scientists, Otis Heiss. Heiss also comes up as the guy who knows how to explore the ice caves, implying that he could be connected to Annie K. Danvers discovers that the power is cut both in the Clark video and in the Annie K video. In turn, Oliver Takak has disappeared, leaving behind only a stone with the spiral symbol on it. Danvers and Navarro find Otis Heiss in a dredging machine. Otis is wearing Clark's parka that used to belong to Annie K. In episode 5, Danvers interrogates Otis about Clark. Otis mentions that Clark used to utter "she's awake" often. The connection between the Silver Sky Mine and the Salal station is established through the tunnels. Anchorage results on the corpsicle come back and state that the scientists were game-ended in a slab avalanche. It is revealed that Hank has been working for Silver Sky Mining, which was alluded to earlier in episode 3 with the mishandling of the Annie K case. Danvers calls off the Salal investigation and Navarro simply refuses. Danvers talks for a moment but gets back on the case after hearing that there have been 9 stillbirths recently tied to the pollution from Silver Sky Mine. Hank game ends Otis Heiss. He also completely out of the blue, mentions that he didn't kill Annie K, just moved her body. Didn't know that the show was implying that he was the culprit, but I guess he just had to get that off his chest. In episode 6, Danvers and Navarro go explore the ice caves. Otis Heiss apparently wasn't needed for this, even though such a big hoopla has been made about his importance. They spot Clark and begin chasing. All of a sudden, they are under Salal Station in the location where Annie K disappeared in the video. Danvers discovers Annie K's murder weapon. By the way, Clark really shuffled on out of there without making a sound, even though you have to move this huge shelf. Clark gets interrogated and he reveals that the scientist game ended Annie K for destroying their research. This group of scientists went full-on Agatha Christie, apparently. Eventually, a group of workers came to Salal and discovered what had happened. They forced the scientists into a truck, drove them out on the ice, and forced them out there. And bada bim bada boom, there's the mystery and its solution. By the way, I love how this kidnapping happens without even one of these bloodthirsty Salal scientists raising their fists in anger. I get that they're outgunned, but this is a group of killers by the show's own logic. But I digress. Before I say anything more, let me elaborate that this isn't a good way of looking at any story. You can reduce anything to its core elements and it will look stupid. However, what I would like to draw your attention to is how much stuff is happening in between these revelations about Salal or the Annie K cases. You've got Danvers' family life, Tindering, drinking, Navarro hanging out with Kavik, getting beat up, numerous hallucinations, taking care of her sister's whole arc, Leah's anti-mine meetup, protest, and the vandalizing of Silver Sky Mine, her getting more in touch with her roots, Pete's family matters, him and Leah's friendship, Hank's sad lonely life playing guitar and painting his house, the whole thing with his mail-order bride, and his corruption, Rose's time with Travis, her background, etc, etc. These things take up so much of the runtime that isn't that long in the first place. That would be totally fine if the show had interesting characters, but ultimately none of the character arcs are nearly as interesting as the corpsicle or the supernatural elements in the show. The end product is a narrative that doesn't know what it wants to be. It's not a good character drama, nor is it an interesting murder mystery. In comparison, the first season finds a good balance between maintaining the central mystery, which happens on 2 timelines, and the personal lives of the protagonists. I care about what is going on with the protagonists and Maggie as much as I care about the Yellow King and Carcosa. Where Night Country stumbles is in the assumption that the audience will accept the character arcs of the protagonists as an alternative to the mystery. A few things factor into this. First and foremost, as I have already examined, the central character arcs use this maddening, far too subtle style of writing, and there are simply too many characters that the show focuses on. The beautiful simplicity of Rust, Marty, and to some extent Maggie character arcs in the first season give the writer more time to focus on the mystery and, more importantly, world build the Louisiana of the first season. Night Country struggles to redeem its protagonists, neglects the conclusion to its side characters' arcs almost entirely, and fails to make the mystery interesting. That's not even a personal anecdote, as I have already displayed. Night Country really is more about the characters than the central mystery. Second point, there's a weird lull in the mystery plotline from episodes 3 to 5. We've established that Clark is the only survivor of Salal outside of Lund, and that finding him is going to be important to figuring out the mystery. As the audience, I'm thinking, oh, this Clark guy is creepy, we need to find him ASAP. And after this, all of a sudden, we are introduced to even more names of men that the detectives are going to be tracking: Oliver Takak and Otis Heiss. Technically, these men also factor into the mystery, but it's getting to the point where the logic of why finding these men instead of Clark is important. To clarify, Danvers wants to find Otis Heiss because he knows how to explore the ice caves, and he happened to also come up as a guy who has similar injuries to the dead Salal scientists. Danvers and Navarro literally stumble onto Otis Heiss as they're tracking Clark. Now, I get that from a screenwriter's perspective, Clark can't be found earlier. He's too large of a piece in this jigsaw puzzle. If they found him in episode 3, the mystery would be resolved in episode 4. However, this is a corner that the screenwriters wrote themselves into. No one told them to show that Clark is still alive at the end of episode 2. If the show had maintained the idea that Clark is in the corpsicle, then the audience wouldn't be expecting for him to show up in episodes 3, 4, and 5. That's a bad way of doing it, but once again, I'm not a professional screenwriter. As it stands, half of the show's runtime is spent with this nagging sense that Clark is going to be the most important piece of this puzzle, which is also why focusing on Otis Heiss all of a sudden feels like the show is spinning its wheels. The third reason why the character drama doesn't work as an alternative to the mystery is because everyone watching the show will know that the show is called True Detective. This is the fourth entry into a crime procedural anthology, and other entries have been about the central mystery. So not only does Night Country fail to replicate the formula of the previous seasons, misleading the audience, but it also fails as a crime procedural overall. I don't need Danvers or Navarro to repeat the typical beats of the hard-boiled detective, but I would like to see a narrative that is about detective work. For a show that is called True Detective, it is bizarre how little the protagonists are doing, well, detecting. It's like the crime procedural elements are an afterthought instead of being a main focus. I like that the show tries to give Danvers and Pryor this mentor-protege relationship, and I like the scene where they're trying to puzzle together the mystery in episode 2, but this relationship gets eaten up entirely by the Danvers-Navarro dynamic. Pryor becomes a mouthpiece for the audience to figure out what actually happened between Danvers and Navarro in their previous case, and that's pretty much it. Relating to the central mystery, so many different interesting plot threads are just dropped. The scientist died from fright. Holy moly, that's interesting. I wonder what the conclusion is going to be. And it's never brought up again. The power cuts off abruptly in both videos. I wonder what the answer for this riddle is going to be. Just bad wiring and stormy weather, I guess. Both Navarro and Danvers hear an eerie "she's awake." Oh, I don't know, it's something supernatural. I understand that mysteries have to have red herrings, but when the final answer barely resembles any of the evidence that the audience has been given, the conclusion becomes immensely frustrating. A common philosophy of good criticism is to judge the end product for what it is rather than what you wish it would have been. Here, however, I think it's justified to critique Night Country for not resembling the earlier seasons because this is an entry into the True Detective series. If the show was just called Night Country instead of True Detective Night Country, I wouldn't make this point, but alas, it is. This is more a critique towards HBO specifically. As Lopez mentioned on the Watch podcast, this wasn't originally pitched as a season of True Detective, but as an entirely different show.
But I knew that it was going to be a murder mystery. I knew it was going to be in the Arctic, and I knew the very beginning and the ending. And at that point, I got a call from HBO saying, "What would you do with True Detective?"
In this sense, it's unfortunate that this season has to be judged against the merits of the first season, but this is also a critique that HBO invited onto itself by taking this narrative under the True Detective umbrella. In fact, I think Night Country is closer to Twin Peaks instead of other seasons of True Detective. It's more eerie, more horror-influenced, and just overall weirder. What's lacking, though, is the charm of Twin Peaks. I've been harsh on the narrative specifically, but these elements were at least an interesting departure from my expectations of the show. I absolutely love Twin Peaks and horror in general, so I don't mind the clear nods to The Thing, nor the interpretative dance that Travis Cole gives. I'm just thankful that he didn't start speaking backwards. That is to say that although I appreciate these elements, they ultimately fall short of everything that they're inspired by. The jump scares are terrible, probably too scary for non-horror fans and not scary enough for fans of horror. The weird elements are present in the first episode and are discarded after that. It's set dressing to give the show a more horror-inspired look and feel without actually making it horror.
What do you want from me?
It is kind of weird to think that this show was originally pitched as an original intellectual property, considering that this season has the most crossover with the first season of True Detective. And that crossover is fairly blatant. The most common tie-in from the first season is the spiral symbol. It's how Danvers places the evidence files. It's on the forehead of one of the dead scientists. It's tattooed on Clark. Rose makes the claim that it's a force older than Ennis or the ice itself. It's how the skeletal structure is formed on the ice cave. It's on this gas tank. It's on the stone that is used to warn hunters. It's how Danvers peels an orange. It's just too much. I was never under the assumption that they were going to make a direct sequel to the first season, but I still find the inclusion of the spiral symbol a bizarre choice. It's like you're telling the audience that the mystery of the first season is connected to the mystery of Night Country, but ultimately you're just diluting the central evil of the first season. I can buy that the spiral becomes a stand-in for this eclectic supernatural evil that influences the events of season 1 and Night Country, but wouldn't it have just been much much more interesting if Night Country came up with its own symbol. I loved it when the first season of Westworld used the maze as a motif of the mystery, and I think I would have enjoyed the spiral in the season much more if it wasn't a spiral. Think about it this way. What if the central motif had been any other symbol? Let's say a triangle, for example. The fans would have started immediately to speculate what it could mean and how it might tie into the themes and the narrative of the season. The purist defenders of the first season couldn't have called this fan service, and they would have focused on the text itself instead of trying to shoehorn their expectations of the season, tying it into the first one. Obviously, they would have called it like copying the first season or something like that, but regardless. The conversation for the most part would have been about the fourth season, not the first one. What instead ended up happening is that the audience saw the spiral symbol and immediately came to the conclusion that there must be a link between the first season and the fourth one. This is when people started speculating that Rust Cole might show up in this newest season. The spiral implied that the knowledge of the themes of the first season was going to be key to understanding the message of this season, that time is a flat circle again or something like that. The screenwriters, knowing full well that the connections were shoddy at best, had written themselves into a situation where people were going to be disappointed regardless. Once again, a reminder, the marketing department at HBO leaned onto this even before the first episode aired, priming the audience to expect a connection between the seasons. As it stands, the meaning of the spiral in the context of season 4 alone is incredibly muddled. It's a symbol that hunters use to warn each other about dangerous places. But then again, it's also how one peels an orange, or something that the workers paint onto one of the Salal scientists as they're forced to walk on the ice. Why is the spiral on the gas tank in episode 4? What does it represent in this context? Some vague notion of danger? Is it the same danger that is being implied when Danvers peels an orange or places her evidence files into a spiral? Usually motifs like these are used to convey a link to the central theme of the story. Here, the use of the motif is so common that it fails to convey anything about the central themes of the narrative. Moving on from the spiral, what makes even less sense is the reuse of the time is a flat circle utterance. In the final episode, Clark all of a sudden screams,
Say the line!
Clark.
Time is a flat circle.
in a moment that honestly comes out of nowhere. What exactly is the implication here? That Clark has read some Nietzsche? That he's a big fan of Rust Cole? I genuinely don't understand what the actual implication is within the text itself. It makes sense when Reggie Ledoux says it, because he clearly has been reading many eclectic texts through Errol Childress, and the first season makes it a point to show how this one moment affects Rust deeply for the many years to come. Here, however, the inclusion is just abrupt and, let's be honest, pointless. The writers also felt that it would be a smart idea to shoehorn Travis Cole, Rust's father, and the Tuttles to Night Country. In the end, what is the narrative function behind Rose having a relationship with Travis Cole specifically? Travis does lead the investigation to the Corpsicle, but why did they feel the need to make this character Travis Cole? Well, I can hear in my voice I'm used to saying Travis Scott, so my brain tries to say Travis Cole. Jesus Christ. Sure, it's a tie-in. The first season establishes that Rust's father lives in Alaska, but I can't help but to feel like this decision was informed more by fan service than by any actual story logic. The Tuttles unfortunately fall into the same category. Why does it matter that the Tuttles are funding the Salal station? It's not like the detectives do anything with this information in the season. Eventually, the connection isn't that the Tuttles were funding Salal, it's that the Tuttles were funding the Silver Sky Mine and Salal. I guess it was just too early to reveal the connections between Silver Sky and Salal, so they had to come up with this Tuttle buffer. However, if the Tuttles were replaced with any other name, the show wouldn't change in the slightest. Actually, it's even worse because the Tuttle buffer primes the audience to expect that Salal and Silver Sky must be evil because they're funded by the evil Tuttles, which of course ends up being the case. One could argue that I'm overreading into these tie-ins and that they were never intended to tie the first season into Night Country. It's an anthology, this is just adding some flavorful connections to the previous season. It's not a big deal. American Horror Story 2 refers back to the previous seasons and you're not getting mad about that. But what's actually missing from this argument is that none of the other seasons of True Detective have tied back to the first season like this. There have been small nods, but nothing at this scale. American Horror Story is far more campy in tone, and the nods to the previous seasons are often played off fast, unless they decide to dedicate an entire season to bringing back characters like they did with Season 1 and Season 8.
You're a snack and I haven't had a good picking in forever. Any picking, really?
Damn, I really want to cover American Horror Story on the channel, by the way. Tell me in the comments if you'd be interested in that. One could argue that these are red herrings to throw off the viewers, but then again, how lazy is it to use red herrings from previous seasons instead of coming up with new ones that are specifically tied to this narrative? If someone hasn't seen the first season, then it's not a very good red herring now, is it? Time is a flat circle specifically doesn't even work under this reading. It's fairly obvious why these tie-ins are in Night Country. They're there to bait the fans of the first season to speculate about the potential connections. Harshly put, it's member berries and fan service. What I would have preferred was for Night Country to stand on its own 2 feet and not try to connect these seasons. I love to see creators hyped about their own material. Night Country should feel like it stands on its own, but tying it this strongly to the first season just gives off a feeling of underconfidence in the material. As we know, this season wasn't originally supposed to be a season of True Detective, so there could be the off chance that the HBO demanded a stronger connection to the first season, but whatever might be the case, it was a poor choice. Isa Lopez has clarified in numerous interviews that the reason for these tie-ins wasn't to bait the fans of the first season and that it just organically came to the writers in the room. Personally, I don't see how this could possibly be the case, but I thought that it would be worth mentioning here.
What do you want from me?
By the final episode, it had become clear that Night Country would leave some elements of its story open-ended, open to interpretation. I was personally assuming that the show would eventually explain all the supernatural elements away with the tap water being tainted or something like that, and I was at least impressed that the season decided to draw a line that the events were actually supernatural. This is the first time that True Detective has made the allusions to the supernatural events apparent in the narrative. The first season teases that there might be something supernatural going on, but ultimately lands firmly on the note that these bumpkins really love Robert W. Chambers' writing, and that Rust's hallucinations are a product of his brain chemistry. Nothing else. This has been a topic of discussion on the forums, so let's clear something up. There is no natural explanation to the multiple different supernatural occurrences in Night Country. Rose seeing Travis Cole's ghost, the tongue magically appearing back at the Salal station, Navarro and Danvers both hearing a ghastly "she's awake", Navarro seeing Clark shaking in the final episode, Navarro's cross appearing magically in Danvers' hair, etc, etc. With Navarro's family line, the distinction between the supernatural and mental illness is a bit more blurred, but overall the explanation for the supernatural elements cannot be that everyone's just mentally ill or that the tap water is tainted. This is not a turn of the screw situation. The show itself acknowledges that Ennis is like this, and that's totally fine, by the way.
Bill, come on, this is serious. If you saw someone, you gotta tell me.
Ennis, man. Yeah, you see people sometimes.
Where this choice becomes more difficult to justify is in how many of the plot threads are left hanging by the end of the season. The caribou jumping off the cliff, Clark's seizure and the power being cut. Annie's video too ends on the power being cut, an element that the show itself brings up and does nothing with. The creepy RV with the effigies that Clark had. The spiral stone that spooked Oliver Takak. Actually, what even happened to Oliver? He just disappeared, I guess? How about Lund regaining consciousness for a moment and spouting more of the supernatural stuff in a demonic voice? Is someone possessing him? Is this Navarro's mental illness? I don't know, man. Now, some of these mysteries probably have an explanation in the text. I would actually argue that most of them do have some kind of explanation. It's just open-ended enough that there's going to be someone in the comments of this video writing their own fan theory and claiming that it was in the text itself, and I'm stupid for not noticing it. The caribou thing, for example, could be explained by real events where herds of wild animals actually do this, or by the mind altering the nature of Ennis to the point that the caribou start acting weird. The show itself makes a point of this in episode 3. Navarro bleeds from her ear in the scene because she got beaten up earlier and the ear just happened to act up at this critical moment. Danvers finds Navarro's cross in her hair. Well, okay, actually I can't even come up with a bad explanation for this. What I'm getting caught up on with this side of the narrative is how incredibly unsatisfying it is to leave a mystery this open-ended. If everything is explained with, oh, it was supernatural or oh, it's mental illness, then the show starts to slip into that odd territory where nothing is worth noting because it can be explained away with the presence of something supernatural, which of course only occurs when the screenwriter feels like they've cornered themselves irreversibly. If everything is a supernatural red herring, then nothing has any meaning. It's a very J.J. Abrams type of issue. The screenwriters knew how to draw people in with interesting and often disturbing scenes, but had no idea how to redeem them in a satisfying way. In that sense, the presence of something supernatural isn't a bad thing in itself, but how it is used in terms of the narrative is just incredibly unsatisfying. I hate to rag on Isa Lopez specifically here, but if you have to clarify what actually happened in the story after the fact on Instagram or in an interview, you've clearly written something that is far too open-ended. I'm a big believer in letting the text stand on its own. I'm not I.A. Richards by any means, but are we actually assuming that people will go out and search for Isa Lopez's Instagram posts to make sense of this season 10 years from now?
What do you want from me?
I've already written over 9,000 words and it still feels like there's so much to say about Night Country, but I think it's best that I don't make this video too long or I will lose my mind during the editing. I got into this essay with the notion that it would be easy to display why Night Country fails as a narrative, and yet in the end I've noticed how difficult it is to describe why the elements of the show don't work. The character arcs are there, but they're subtle to the point of absurdity. The scares aren't really scary. The mystery isn't very interesting. The writing is just open-ended enough that virtually anything I say can be disavowed with a different reading. There's truly no winning with this show, and ironically, that is exactly what I dislike about it, but let's not beat a dead horse. Tell me in the comments what you thought about Night Country. I would love to hear from people who liked the season and the reasons why you liked it. Alternatively, feel free to comment if I missed something that you didn't like about the show. I can already sense that this video will be a hotbed of argumentation, so I would like to ask that let's keep it civil and not try to witch hunt any of the creative minds behind this show. To end on a positive note, I think it's very dope that one of the Salal scientists had Letterboxd installed on their phone. A true film bro to the end. What a Chad. Thanks for watching. I'm currently working on a video essay about the first season, so if you're interested in that, do subscribe and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.